Okay, so picture this, right? You're Usain Bolt, fastest man on the planet, at the top of your game,
Wow.
and suddenly, bam, your retirement fund is gone.
Just like that.
Vanished. And unfortunately, this isn't some hypothetical. This is the reality in Jamaica right now with this whole Stocks and Securities Limited meltdown.
Yeah, and it's a story that goes way beyond just one athlete. You know what I mean? This situation really gets at the heart of a nation's financial security
Right.
investor trust. This is a big deal.
Huge. I mean, SSL was a major player in Jamaica.
Oh, yeah.
Handling investments, they had big names attached to them. So how does a company like this just implode?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, literally.
Yeah.
Some reports suggest the losses could be over $12 million US.
Wow.
That's a staggering amount.
That's a huge amount of money.
Huge. Now, SSL has mentioned they did a portfolio sale that brought in about $30 million.
Okay.
But is that even enough? And more importantly,
Right.
who's getting a piece of that? It's a mess.
Okay, so let's break down exactly what SSL did. So they managed investments for people.
Right.
But how does a company just collapse like that?
Well,
And what does this sale even mean for people who just want their money back?
so at their core, SSL is essentially a middleman in the financial world. They would take people's money and invest it in various assets, hoping to grow their wealth.
Makes sense.
Now, selling off a chunk of their portfolio, that could be a strategic move,
Got it.
especially in a crisis like this. It could mean they're trying to, cut their losses, maybe even start repaying some investors.
That's a good sign.
Maybe. It could
Yeah.
be a good sign, but
But 30 million
yeah,
compared to what? 12 million, you said, in losses.
at least.
It's
Essentially, yeah. Could be a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, that's not even half.
Exactly. And it all hinges on how deep this hole actually is.
Right.
And then there's the issue of how this money, if it even comes through, gets divided up amongst the investors.
Right. Is everyone going to get a little piece?
Yeah, is it a free-for-all,
Uh-huh.
or are some investors going to get preferential treatment?
It's complicated.
It's a tangled web, for sure.
And we can't forget about the human element of this whole thing.
Right.
You mentioned it earlier.
Oh, absolutely.
Bolt's tweets. And while they were short, you can tell there's this feeling of betrayal there.
Oh.
This wasn't just some cash tucked away. For a lot of these people, it represents years, decades of hard work, dreams.
You're right. This goes way beyond just numbers on a balance sheet. It erodes trust, not just in SSL, but in Jamaica's entire financial system.
Wow.
And that can have really long-lasting repercussions.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
Okay, so we've talked about SSL. We've talked about kind of what they did, what went wrong.
right.
But how did this happen? Like, how does this even happen in this day and age?
Yeah, it's a good question.
And, speaking of repercussions, this whole SSL thing has turned into a bit of a political hot potato, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. The Jamaican Labour Party, the JLP, they're walking a tightrope right now.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, they're pushing for SSL to pay back investors. But then on the other, they're saying, hey, we had nothing to do with this.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to distance themselves from the whole thing.
Exactly.
Right, because you've got some people saying, hold on, the government should have seen this coming. Maybe there wasn't enough oversight, So what's the JLP's game plan here? Is it just damage control?
Well, it has that classic crisis management feel, right?
Yeah.
Acknowledge the public anger, especially with Usain Bolt being involved, by calling for SSL to make things right.
Right.
It's a way of showing, hey, we're with the people,
Mhm.
but they're also making it very clear this was a private company dropping the ball,
Yeah.
not the government.
Right. Which makes sense. I mean, the JLP has always been all about private sector solutions.
Right.
But is it common? I mean, does this happen a lot where governments get roped into bailing out these private companies?
It does happen,
Yeah.
especially when a company going under could trigger a domino effect,
Right.
impacting jobs, the economy, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
The arguments for stepping in usually center around, trying to prevent things from getting even worse.
Okay, so like a too big to fail kind of.
Exactly. But there's a flip side to that coin.
Okay.
It's this idea of moral hazard, where companies might take bigger risks,
Oh, interesting.
knowing that the government might just come in and save the day, so it discourages accountability.
So it's a tough call.
It is.
So has Jamaica ever done this before? Like actually bailed out a company?
Not on this scale. I mean, there's been support for struggling industries. But a full-blown bailout for an investment firm? That'd be pretty unprecedented in Jamaica.
Wow.
And the finance ministry, they've even hinted that doing something like that could set a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, I bet. So
Yeah.
they're really leaning on this idea of SSL's owners having, like, a moral obligation to fix this whole thing.
Right.
But legally speaking, I mean, what does that even mean? Is a moral obligation actually binding?
That's a key difference to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Moral obligation, that's about what's ethically right, you know?
Yeah.
But it doesn't automatically translate to legal responsibility.
Right.
Investors, they'd have to prove that SSL was negligent or that there was some kind of criminal activity going on to have a solid case.
So let's talk about the legal options here. For those investors who are desperate to get their money back, what can they actually do?
So there are a few paths they could take, but each one has its challenges.
Okay.
Like if Jean Ann Panton, the former employee who was charged,
Right.
if she's found guilty, investors could try to get restitution as part of her sentencing.
So basically she'd be ordered to pay them back.
In theory, yes, but whether she could actually repay such a huge amount, that's a big question mark.
Right, right.
Another option would be to go after SSL's insurance policies,
Okay.
if they had any that covered this type of fraud.
Okay.
But that depends on the specifics of their coverage.
Right. So insurance is kind of iffy. What else is there?
Well, this is where the liquidator enters the picture.
Okay.
Think of them as a financial detective.
Okay.
Their job is to track down all of SSL's assets,
Okay.
bank accounts, properties, anything of value, and figure out how to sell it all off to pay back creditors, including those who invested.
Sounds like a massive undertaking, especially with so much money on the line.
Oh, it's a huge job, and it could take years.
Wow.
And even then, it's unlikely to recoup all the losses.
Right.
A lot of those investors, they might only see a fraction of their money, if anything at all.
That's tough.
It's a difficult situation all around.
And speaking of difficult situations, Jean Ann Panton's role in this is just, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Who is she, and how could she allegedly get away with something like this for so long? So she was a client relationship manager at SSL.
Right.
That's a pretty, I mean, you got to trust that person, right? Access to accounts and all that financial info.
Absolutely. A position of trust, for sure. And it seems like, from what we're piecing together, her scheme revolved around using that access to siphon off funds for personal use, and not just for a short while. We're talking potentially over a decade.
10 years. A decade. Like,
Yeah.
how does no one notice that? I mean, come on. Internal controls, audits, there's got to be external regulators.
Right, you would think so.
How does this slip through the cracks for so long?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
This whole situation really shines a light on some potential weaknesses in Jamaica's financial system.
Yeah.
Were there enough safeguards? Was oversight lacking? These are questions that need answers.
I mean, it's almost unbelievable. We were talking about Usain Bolt here.
Yeah.
If it can happen to him.
Right.
It makes you wonder who else is out there? Who else is vulnerable?
And that's just it, right? This
Yeah.
isn't about a single high-profile case. This is about the system as a whole. When you have this level of breach of trust, it sends shockwaves.
It makes everybody nervous.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, okay, what happens now? I mean, what needs to change to make sure this doesn't happen again? Are we talking a complete overhaul here?
It's certainly possible. I mean, this could be a catalyst for some major changes. We might see tighter regulations, more frequent audits,
Okay.
maybe even stronger protections for whistleblowers, the whole 9 yards.
But realistically, how likely is it that those changes actually happen?
That's the big question mark. I mean, there's definitely going to be a lot of pressure for change, especially with public trust shaken like this.
Right.
But whether that actually translates to meaningful, lasting reforms, only time will tell.
It's a waiting game.
It is. It is.
It definitely feels like this story's not over yet.
Not by a long shot.
We have to keep following it and see what happens.
Absolutely.
Well, this deep dive has been, to say the least, really eye-opening.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts as we wrap things up here?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is the importance of staying vigilant,
Okay.
both on an individual level and a systemic level, right?
Right.
This whole situation, it just really drives home the need for transparency, accountability, and really strong oversight within financial institutions.
Yeah.
But it also highlights how important it is for people to be informed, ask questions, and really be proactive about protecting their own financial well-being.
Be your own advocate. I think that's a great point. And, it makes you think, even Usain Bolt, the fastest man in the world, and he couldn't outrun this.
It's true.
It just goes to show, this can affect anyone.
It can.
And we all have to do our part to make sure things are fair
Right.
and that the financial system is actually protecting people.
Absolutely.
Well, that's our show for today. This has been The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time. Stay curious.